Hello and welcome to episode 326 of Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And with me is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this fine March 5th morning, Bill?
I'm doing great, Seth. And before we begin, I want an announcement, public service announcement. For you Annapolis graduates, Seth and I will be doing a session the afternoon of April 25th at the Naval Academy Alumni Association in Annapolis, the new headquarters. We will share registration details later, but the event will be open to midshipmen and graduates. So if you're in the Annapolis area on April 25th and want to attend, you might want to pencil that date onto your calendar. So, Seth, I'm excited about that, but I'm more excited about what we're going to talk about today.
I am excited about both things, and I just want to say once again, I said it before, I'll say it again. I am honored to have been, or to be a part of this event at the Naval Academy, and I will do my best to grace the hallowed halls with my lowly presence. So we'll do what we can. So those who are watching right now, notice a odd formation within the pattern. Instead of our usual 3 guests, we have 4 for the first time ever. And the 4th one is a very special guest, someone we've wanted to have on here for a while. But we'll go in order of seniority, as we say. And we want to welcome our good buddy, Jon Parshall. Jon, how are you this fine March day?
I am very well, thank you. Lovely to be back here again.
Always good to have you. And to welcome Tim to our show for the very first time, we want to welcome Tony Tully. Tony is Jon's co-author on Shattered Sword. He is the author of the book on the Battle of Surigao Strait. Tony, we are very glad to have you here, man. Thank you very much for joining us. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. I'm delighted for the invitation, Seth. I mean, looking forward to it.
Gonna be a good time.
I get to say now, my esteemed co-author, don't I?
Yes, you do.
You do.
That's right.
Yes, you
All
do.
right. Done that.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Well, before we get started, we want to ask everybody to like and subscribe to our channel. If you haven't already done so, please do so. And if you have done so, thank you very much. So, on with today's show. Revenge. It is a dish best served cold, as the saying goes. And by October 1944, the U.S. Navy had more than served that dish to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many helpings of the dish, to be perfectly honest. But as your grandma probably told you at family dinners, one more helping ain't gonna hurt you. The same could be said of the U.S. Navy and their attitude towards the Japanese. Full payback for Pearl Harbor would never be exacted until every Japanese ship lay in the ocean's bottom. In reality, by October 1944, that payback had been exacted many times over by America's aircraft carriers, submarines, and naval aviators. In the waters off the Solomons, payback was dished out in the form of American destroyers and cruisers pounding Imperial destroyers and cruisers into submission. Off Guadalcanal, the same could be said when American cruisers and destroyers fought toe-to-toe with the then mighty IJN. However, the only time that a surface warship larger than a cruiser engaged an enemy warship, an American warship larger than a cruiser, was when Washington executed Kirishima that night in November 1942. And for the most part, the ships that had done most of the fighting in 42 were not at Pearl Harbor. Some had not even been built when Pearl was attacked. And of those that were Pearl veterans, only a handful had been damaged during the Japanese raid. The same could not be said for the Pacific Fleet's dreadnoughts of 1941 vintage. The majority of those ships had been ravaged by the Japanese as they were tied up at Battleship Row. Their role thus far in the war had been mostly shore bombardment, which was something they excelled at, but not what they were designed for. Many of the sailors aboard battleships, West Virginia, California, Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, were new sailors. But even the new sailors who had signed up after Pearl could feel the desire to exact revenge on the Japanese that permeated seemingly every inch of those old, proud girls. As the Battle of Leyte Gulf swelled in scope by October 25th, those old, proud girls would finally get their chance. They would finally get the chance to avenge their humiliation of December 7th, 1941, at a place called Surigao Strait. And I cannot think of a better guest to have for this program than Tony. So let's dig into this epic naval clash of dreadnoughts, the last time in history, guys. It all starts with the Southern Force. Now, in last week's episode, Jon, Bill, and I, we talked about Center Force in some respects, talking about Sibuyan Sea and Kurita. And we mentioned in passing that there were 4 forces that were part of Leyte Gulf: Center Force, Southern Force, Shima's force, and of course Ozawa's Northern Force. The Japanese Southern Force, as it's called, it was another of these Japanese fingers that were assigned to poke the Americans in the eye, so to speak, at Leyte Gulf, along with Kurita's Center Force, Southern Force, under the command of Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji. And we're going to let you guys dig into Nishimura here in just a minute. Was to penetrate Leyte Gulf and engage and destroy American amphibious forces supporting the Leyte landings. Now, guys, Southern Force, when you look at the TO and E of everything, Southern Force was significantly weaker than the other forces that are going to be engaged in this battle, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's basically built around the two oldest battleships in the Japanese inventory, Fuso and Yamashiro. And, you know, just to kind of get into them a little bit, you know that for me, the gateway drug to the Imperial Navy was building model ships of their cruisers back when I was a 5th grader. And there's something very distinctive about Japanese naval architecture. You know, the ships just don't look like anybody else's. And again, as a 5th grader, I was like, man, these things are just so cool. And I think that anyone who's into the Imperial Navy would also say that their battleships are incredibly distinctive looking too, you know, because they've got those incredibly intricate, complicated pagoda superstructures. And the doctrinal reason for that was that the Japanese wanted to get their gun directors as high above the waterline as possible, because they had a bit of what I would call an outranging fetish. You know, I've got to hit the enemy as far away as possible. Well, that translated into these crazy looking pagoda superstructures, which I submit actually amounts to a bit of a fetish for anybody who's into the IJN. You know, we're just all into the, oh man, you know, they had the coolest superstructures. And Fuso and Yamashiro are just, you know, poster childs for this whole thing. And I do, of course, have the primary nerd book on this battleship, and you can just see, you know, it's just endlessly tall. It's got this
44 meters.
Yeah, you know, it's got this cool thing that sticks out the back, and it's just, and Yamashiro's got these big supports that hold them up in the back. I mean, they're just like, ooh, superstructures. So these are old ships, though, and that's the thing to keep in mind. These are the first post-dreadnought battleships that the Japanese had launched. They were put in the water in the early part of World War I. They are armed with 14-inch guns. They got 6-inch secondaries. One of the problems with them, though, is that they've got 12 14-inch guns, which is quite a bit of armament, but they're all in twin turrets, which means that the waterline length of these things, and hence the length of the armored box that has to protect those 6 turrets and their magazines, is really long too, which means that on average, the armor is not as thick on these things as it could be. Likewise, since these are World War I era combatants, their anti-torpedo systems are nothing to write home about. They don't have the kind of width and depth to their torpedo bulkhead systems that are going to allow them to resist torpedo damage as well as a ship like, say, Musashi or Yamato or something like that. Tony, anything you want to riff on there?
Yeah, I would point out for some audience, a way to really relate to it. It'd be like if the U.S. Navy had sent the Texas and the New York into a surface battle, or even the Wyoming, you know, and Arkansas. I mean, they were the oldest ones of the Japanese fleet. Even more, the Issei and Hyuga had just been made into half hybrid carriers, and they were a little bit more modernized than Yuso and Yamashiro. I mean, so that's a way to think about how old they were. I mean, Texas just got renovated, and she dates back to, she's almost the exact direct contemporary Fuso. So that's what's really interesting about it. They're both classic dreadnought battleships. They were the biggest ships at the time, but some of the most powerful when they were laid down. But as you know, military, you know, arms race things, they don't last long. And with for a while, Fuso was the biggest, baddest thing that was an operation, but it was only briefly. But like John said, it has a outsized reputation for its particularly convoluted pagoda. I had mentioned offhand is 44 meters high. Yamashiro's is very much the same thing, but a little more straighter and stiffer.
Yeah.
And something else I wanted to mention about the battleships in particular is that they had been tied down in training in the NC throughout almost all the war. So
Yeah.
if you take what Jon said and consider the fact that they also spend all their time, okay, imagine, doing work up in Chesapeake Bay, that kind of thing. That's spending a whole war there. But normally, the Fuso and Yamashiro, they were on secondary duties. And Fuso actually saw a little more use than Yamashiro did, in the sense that Yamashiro spent a lot of time in inland sea. But that also meant she's kind of kept in good shape. One thing they weren't is in bad shape when they sailed. They were in top-notch condition. And the Fuso's crew considered her a happy ship. So these were not demoralized vessels when they sailed. They actually eagerly did.
They're just really old. So yeah.
Older than Go ahead.
No, I have a question though. This is these on the American side. These ships are, not 20 years. I mean, this is 20 years out of the Great White Fleet, right? But a lot of evolution happened between the Great White Fleet and this generation of battleships, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see too that even though these are the oldest battleships they have been extensively modernized. They went through two big refits in the 1930s. Among other things, their main batteries were modified so that they could elevate further and therefore fire farther. And those refits were where the pagoda foremasts got put on as well. So, I mean, yeah, there's certainly an understanding within the Imperial Navy that these are not units that are fit to stand in the main line of battle, and that's why they've been doing training duties all war long. But they have been as modernized as it's possible to do to a unit of that vintage.
And that's what I wanted to ask is, go ahead, Tony.
Just want to interject. Important to realize the other limiting factor, not just age. They couldn't break 24 knots easily. They couldn't reach that. Barely 23 or so. I mean, there was an operation when the Japanese were preparing for Go during the Philippine Sea battle buildup. When the battleship sailed out to sea after Taiho, the Nagato could just barely make 24 knots, so she's barely allowed to participate. Fuso couldn't even keep up with that, so she was removed from the operation and given a secondary assignment, which we'll probably get into later. But
yeah,
so their speed could barely make over 20 knots. That as far as easily, they could reach 23 if they pushed it. That's an important limitation also. Had they been faster, they might have been more willing to lose.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to get into is that they're part of Bat Div 2. They're part of Battleship Division 2. And Bat Div 2 within the IJN was at that time not looked upon very favorably. Right. However, there was one specific mission that one of them was assigned to WIGO during the Marianas campaign. Can you guys get into a little bit of that about how the IJN felt about Bat Div 2 and their expendability? Really, is that they felt that they were expendable? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Tony, WIGO.
Oh, okay. During the Battle of Philippine Sea, the Japanese were committing, much like they would Leyte Gulf later. They were committing to a full effort. In some ways, a little bit less on certain areas, but is a full out effort in the sense that the stakes were considered incredibly high to saving Saipan. So, in the enthusiasm as Ozawa's carrier fleet sailed toward its battle, back in Japan, Shigenori Kami, the chief of operations in the Japanese Naval General Staff, a real hothead, okay, came up with the idea of let's have training battleship Yamashiro do its part by sailing from the inland sea, packed with soldiers, and beach herself on Saipan, deliver the soldiers, and become a shore battery to repel American landing forces. Now, does that sound familiar to some of you? It probably does, because that's the same suicide mission Yamato is given at Okinawa.
Right.
It's the same guy.
Which is crazy, but there it is.
Yeah, I'll let Jon expound upon the logistical chances of it succeeding.
Well, just, the lunacy of trying to take a ship like this and actually beach it and turning it into a battery of some sort. Right. It's going to be pounded to pieces by American aircraft in the space of about 14 minutes. It's survivability of these platforms is extremely limited by their maneuverability. And if you take all the maneuverability away and turn yourself into a stationary target, the spittle is running down my chin, and we know how that's going to end. Anyway, to say that the Japanese were grasping at straws here is a bit of an understatement.
It's interesting all the same, though, is that this is, a first version of a nautical bonsai charge, if you will.
Right.
Well, we talked about Yeah, yeah. We talked about the two battle wagons. Bill, they weren't the only pieces of this Japanese force, though, were they?
No, they weren't. You know, the Southern Force also consisted of the heavy cruiser Megami and 4 destroyers. Not nearly as powerful as Kurita's Setter Force, the Southern Force would also be theoretically augmented by an additional force under the command of Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide. Did I do okay with that, guys?
Yep, Kiyohide. Yep.
The additional force consisted of an additional 7 ships. Shima's force centered around the heavy cruiser Nachi and Ashigara, light cruiser Abukuma, and 4 destroyers. Interesting, guys. I spent a lot of time in Japan. I used to be able to pronounce these words a lot better as I get into my dotage. I lose the ability to pronounce Japanese names. I don't know why.
They're going back to the amino acids whence they came, but yeah, I hear you. So
the overall commander of the Southern Force was Vice Admiral. Now I'm going to try it your way, Tony. Nishimura Shoji, described within the Imperial Japanese Navy as an old sea dog, even though he's younger than I am now. Nishimura had seen his fair share of naval combat throughout the war. Okay, guys. So what about this Nishimura guy? Who was he? What was his history? Can you get into his hard luck background in detail?
Batting this right to Tony.
Oh, he was a graduate of the Ada Gemma class of July 1911. And what's interesting is so was Shima. So they're classmates. They're just about 6 months apart in seniority. That'll matter later. But he's he's 59 years old by the time of the event. So, and he had had his background right leading up pre-war. He had commanded some cruisers and stuff, but his main interest was in torpedo warfare, as in torpedo boat warfare, Desrons, and destroyer squadrons, and the like. And so that was his background when we first hear about him in any major sense. Right after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese are invading the Philippines, Nishimura is commanding one of the forces covering the landings at Beacon in the Lungalian area and up in Luzon. That's his first bit of action. Unfortunately, yet near the end of that month, his only son, Teji, is killed during a float recon of all places in the Surigao Strait area. But when we next hear him in a very major sense, he's at the Battle of Java Sea and commanded Desron 4. Also present alongside him is Desron 2 under the famous Tanaka Reizo. Those two, supported by Nachi and her girl, they fight the Battle of Java Sea.
The bottom line is, I mean, this is a guy that's got pretty extensive experience by this point in the war. I mean, he's fought a number of night battles. He's a torpedo expert, but he's also, I would say, somewhat cautious by nature. Is that fair, Tony?
I wouldn't say cautious, because what you're really seeing is he plans carefully and deliberately, but once he's set on a course of action, is very forthright and decisive.
Okay, a planner then.
Yeah. Ironically, there's some aspects of him that would look probably looks like Spurance. The deliberativeness.
Right. Interesting.
He uses his assets at Surigao Strait, and I guess we'll get into it a little bit later. He uses what assets he does have actually better than Kurita does, like his recon planes and all that. They were going mount attacks on the PT boats, stuff like that. They're even in action during the night battle. That's not commonly realized. So he's very good at planning what he has. In other words, using what he has. He's doing the same thing at Java Sea, trying to shepherd because you can imagine shepherding a bunch of merchant ship captains, and that's what he's trying to do.
Not a lot of fun.
Herding cats.
Yeah,
just
right.
to briefly touch on his later career, but he comes under the idea. Some of the sense of caution comes from a sense of he comes under an unlucky star at times, because like in 1943, his flagship Kumano is torpedoed in a night battle by aircraft or bomb, damaged by bomb. There's some dispute about just what damaged Kumano, but that and so he gets a reputation for kind of having things go wrong, but never really his fault. The Japanese never really see it as fault. It's just
he's just sort of, as you say, under an unlucky star.
Kind of unlucky star. Kind of like the destroyer Shiguri. It's an open question: is she lucky or a Jonah? See?
Yeah,
she's lucky to herself, but every ship she travels with,
gets
carry her unreal.
Gets waxed. Yeah.
Well, let's Go ahead,
Yeah,
Jon.
go ahead, Seth.
I was going to say let's talk about his plan here for Surigao Strait.
Yep.
Bill, he's got a pretty good. Nishimura's got a pretty good plan, really. If obviously if everything goes right, can you lay it on us? What is his plan here for Surigao? What is his mission? What does he want to do, and how is he going to utilize his forces?
So a planner by nature, Nishimura. So yeah, we love our bloopers reel, by the way. A planner by nature, Nishimura did not plan to rush headlong into the Leyte Gulf. He worked up a good plan of attack should the Southern force be able to make its way into the Gulf. Nishimura was working from the latest sightings of Allied ships in Leyte Gulf and worked out his plan in such a way that his destroyers would sweep around the Gulf from the east and head in a northerly direction. I got a map. People always want to see the map. So the plan was to head up down here and then engage the Americans up north. And that's kind of the way it's going to play out, Seth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To an extent, though, I was just going to say to Tony, but part of what he's trying to do here, though, is draw American attention away from Kurita. And so
it's Ozawa's mission in reverse from the south.
Right.
It's the same mission Ozawa has from the north. The Naval War College had speculated that. Turns out post-war stuff with interviewed Japanese survivors and stuff, especially from Fuso Nimashu, has revealed that is exactly what it was. They all go there fully expecting to be sunk. They're not really expected to get back. It's not strictly a suicide mission any more than Ozawa's is, and that they can get back. But the important thing is to pull the forces out of Kurita's way. So Kurita has an unobstructed approach in the Leyte Gulf from the east. He's going to draw forces down from into the south. Ozawa's going to draw them north. So that's what Jon was saying.
Yeah, Kurita is going to land the haymaker. Is essentially what it is. Yeah, that's the plan anyway. So,
in land warfare, it's called a turning movement, right? You try to get the one deep offense of it, the enemy force, to pivot so you can clear them from hit them on the flanks, in essence.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And not unlike any other Japanese plan that we've seen so far throughout the entire war, really, Nishimura's success depended largely on the element of surprise, which is something he did not possess. He did not know this initially, but he did not possess this at all. Go ahead, Jon, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say, surprise was a commodity that was in very short supply with most Japanese naval operations at this point in the war because our air coverage was so good. Of course, we're going to get a counterexample of that is going to be coming shortly. But Nishimura doesn't have it really.
Indeed, his forces sighted by American aircraft. No surprise here, as we have a fairly large umbrella in the area. His forces attacked the day before Surigao Strait by aircraft from the USS Enterprise.
And Franklin.
Say again?
And Franklin.
And Franklin, correct, yes. Late in the afternoon of October 24th, to be exact. The American force that comes in focuses on both of these battleships, no surprise here. Flyers from Enterprise score hits on Yamashiro with rockets, who was in the lead of the formation and landed a handful of near misses with bombs. Strafing American fighters did little structural damage, and we see this over and over again. We saw this with Musashi at Sibuyan Sea, and we're going to see it again, obviously, Alpha Samar, too. It did little structural damage, but it does knock out a lot of these anti-aircraft gunners. It does kill a lot or wound a lot of people at the very least. To the rear, and we can talk about this in depth here in just a few minutes. Actually, when we get to the destroyer attacks, we will. Fuso was faring a little worse than her sister was. She takes a bomb hit near her number 2 turret. The weapon penetrated the deck and exploded in or near the number 1 secondary battery, wiping out the crew in that vicinity, which is obviously a very nasty scene. Soon after, Fuso receives another hit. This one was near her quarterdeck. The bomb landed on her fantail near her catapult, penetrated the deck, and exploded in the wardroom. One of the ship's depth charges, and Jon, you put this in the notes. What the hell is a battleship doing with depth charges?
What is a battleship doing carrying depth charges? And I honestly don't know the answer. Do you, Tony?
Back in 1939, Fuso's catapult had been moved back under her fantail, just like Yamashiro had, and she carried a group of float planes, Jake float planes, and they were equipped for anti-submarine warfare. They carried depth charges. So she had a pack of depth charges in the sterns for storage.
I got you.
That's what went
Okay.
off. Even in the
Okay.
wreck, you find the bitten out like a bite out of the stern. In the wreck, you find that there's a big chunk out of the stern.
Very, very, very strange for a battleship to have depth charges, but that makes perfect sense the way you
Yeah,
describe it.
yeah, they're okay. They're aerial depth
does.
charges. Yeah, always learning. So
So Fuso looked like she was in pretty dire straits because what happened is the avgas spills on the deck and everything goes poof, and there's a big fire, lots of smoke. The float planes that are on Fuso's after quarter are fire. She shears out of column so as to direct the smoke from the burning aircraft away from the ship so they could be jettisoned, which they were in short order. Nishimura aboard Yamashiro was assured by Fuso's captain that the old battleship, despite the fire and springing some leaks, could and would continue her mission. So, Tony, you put in there that this is an accurate description of the air attacks, but you said you would call the damage medium and not minor. Why is that?
I had in mind that in Japanese damage reports, they use phrases like minor damage, medium damage. And for what Fuso suffered, it's probably closer to their medium category because anything that creates flooding below, like happened with Fuso, that's not minor. That doesn't mean it's major, especially when we think of major, but medium is a term they use for anything that's a little bit more than, well, like strafing damage to the superstructure. Yamashiro's may be considered medium too because it floods the starboard blister. The near misses are enough to rip open the starboard torpedo bulge.
This is me chuckling because it's just yet another indication that you and I have spent way too much time reading damage control report.
They're fascinating. They're fascinating.
Instead of kissing girls. I mean, yeah. Oh well.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, someone's got to do it. Here we are.
Right. Well, Bill, the American air attack by Enterprise and Franklin is really a pittance compared to what Kurita had suffered through, wasn't it? So let's get into that with us for a little bit.
Yeah, it was. The Enterprise's aircraft disappeared over the horizon. Nishimura turns his attention back to his primary mission. On the American side, Admiral Davidson, in Task Group 38.4, decides that no further attacks would be made that day. He receives orders from Halsey to move nearer to 38.2 and launch attacks against Kurita's center force. Okay, they're going to head back north again, thus leaving Nishimura's southern force alone for the remainder of the day. Now, Halsey was aware of the southern force, as you said, Seth, and had rightfully deemed them less important than Kurita. This important issue to come from October 24th in regard to the upcoming battle was that the southern force had been sighted. There would be no surprise Japanese ambush, but there would be a surprised American ambush, Seth.
There, let me tell you. So 7th Fleet Commanding Admiral Thomas Kincaid was keenly aware of Nishimura's southern force and had time to prepare his defenses. Kincaid assumed that Nishimura was going to pass through Surigao Strait on his way into Leyte Gulf, and as such, he signaled his battleship commander, one Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Now, we've talked about Oldendorf a ton of times when we're talking about shore bombardment because this is what he
does.
Yeah, it's what he does. He shoots the land, but he is also a gunfighting admiral. Bill, you're an Academy graduate. I'll usually turn these over to you. Tell us about the Academy class of 1909 grad, Jesse Oldendorf.
He's legendary, of course. He's a few years younger than his bosses, Halsey and Nimitz, commissioned an instant 2 years after he graduated in 1909. Like most Academy men of the era, he spent the vast majority of his early career on surface ships, destroyers, cruisers, but he did serve on battleships. In the early 1930s, he saw his first major service aboard a battleship when he served as XO in USS West Virginia for 2 years. When the war began, he initially served in the Atlantic. Believe it or not, nobody hears any stories about him. Well, most people, you guys know all about this, don't hear stories about him in the Atlantic, but he was there until 1943. Then he transferred to the Pacific as commander of Cruiser Division 4. Once there, he utilized USS Louisville, heavy cruiser CA-28, as his flagship, which is where he would remain for the majority of the time in the Pacific. In February that same year, Oldendorf was put in command of the fire support vessels as part of Terrible Turner's amphibious navy. And we've had a lot of talks
I
about
put that in there
Terrible
for
Turner.
you, John. Terrible.
Yeah, haven't we, John?
Exactly.
John's favorite
geez.
admiral.
My
Yeah.
favorite admiral. Absolutely.
Yeah. Who had no trouble with alcohol at all. So
No.
Ole Oldendorf saw action at the Marshalls, Marianas, Peleliu, Leyte, and Luzon, as his ships provided shore bombardment and call fire support for operations ashore. That's what we were doing with these old battle wagons in those days. But on the eve of Surigao, the highly respected Rear Admiral was in command of Task Force 77.2 and was reacting to orders given to him by Admiral Kinkaid, Seth. So there's the setup.
This is
I would
this is
add,
truly epic. Go ahead.
Sure.
I would add Oldendorf was also a commanding officer of the cruiser USS Houston that went down in the Battle of Java Sea. And that would come into play this night because Mogami he knew about was in that force. And Mogami was an old enemy of his, had sunk Houston in Perth at Bantam Bay in Java Sea. So
he was not there, obviously.
Going back to your idea of paying back scores, this is one that Oldendorf had his eye on Mogami in that force because Mogami, along with Mikuma, which had been sunk all the way back in Midway, they'd been the ones that put down a Houston and Perth, as well as the Japanese destroyers that night. That was a big.
By the way, I gotta say this before we get into naming a bunch of ships. I love the days when you could tell what class a ship was by its name. Cruisers were cities, battleships were state, and all was right with the world.
Right. Sadly, those days are gone, but
those days are gone. Indeed.
That is
indeed.
correct.
So at 1443, Kinkaid signals Oldendorf to prepare his force for a night battle against Japanese battleships with the message, quote, "Enemy can arrive Leyte Gulf tonight. Make all preparations for night engagement," end quote. In his order, Kinkaid provided Ole with his best intel as to the enemy's strength, disposition, course, and speed. Kinkaid also directed Oldendorf to utilize the multitude of PT boats. Now, we've talked about PT boats before, but these guys play a very large role, but it's a different role than history has said in the past. But regardless, we'll get there. And by a lot of PT boats, I'm talking like damn near 40. I think he deploys 39 PT boats in the upcoming battle.
Yeah, way to think of it as 13 trios. Is how I try to remember it.
Yeah. It's a lot of the plywood craft here. So it's interesting. I put this in the notes. It's interesting to note that Kinkaid overstated Nishimura's size to Oldendorf, saying that the Southern force consisted of 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers. This is much larger than the actual force that was there. They only had 7 ships in the entire Southern force. He also advised Oldendorf as to the possibility that the Japanese may have 4 battleships. And Tony, this is because Isa and Hyuga they had not sighted these guys. They didn't know where the hell they were, right?
And there were confused sightings from Franklin and Enterprise's planes, or maybe they thought maybe they're 2 forces. See, they didn't have a clear idea because the battleships could look kind of similar, and there were more than a few that were thinking there are two battleship forces coming. Also, there were confused sightings of Shima, who is astern by now, that were mistaken. Nachi and Nishiguro were taken for battleships by some. So that may have probably influenced his estimate.
Yeah, it's not, as we have seen, it's not uncommon for aviators to grossly exaggerate what they see on the ocean's surface. But never mind that, because Jesse Oldendorf figured that even the force estimate that was given to him that was overstated by Kinkaid, he felt that he could deal with that force coming to him no matter what. He had a force at his disposal that would absolutely obliterate anything that may come his way, or so he thought, which obviously comes to pass. Indeed, Oldendorf had more firepower than he would ever possibly need. Bill, get into some of these ships that are with Oldendorf's force. It's a beast.
It's a load.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. You had 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 28 destroyers, and as you said, Seth, 39 PT boats. As mentioned earlier, 5 of the 6 battleships were Pearl Harbor survivors. Revenge is a dish best served cold. The lone non-Pearl survivor was the Mississippi BB-41. Of the 4 heavy cruisers, one was the HMAS Shropshire and HMAS Arunta. And Jon, you know something about the Arunta, don't you?
Actually, I don't know much about Arunta. The thing that I was struck by was that there's sort of a payback element here too, and that Shropshire was given to the Australians by the Royal Navy to replace the Canberra, which of course had been sunk during the Battle of Savo Island off of Guadalcanal. Arunta is another of these fabulous tribal class destroyers that were just ubiquitous throughout the Royal Navy. But yeah, I think it's even the Aussies are going to get some payback here tonight as part of this larger battle force.
Yeah. So regarding these battleships that we talked about, we've made a big deal that they're Pearl Harbor battleships, and they are old by fast battleship standard. When you compare them like South Dakota and New Jersey, they are old by that standard. However, the oldest one in the line would be Pennsylvania. She was commissioned in 1916. While they were old and they were close to the vintage of Fuso and Yamashiro, most of them had been actually all had been heavily modernized since the beginning of the war. Specifically, West Virginia and Tennessee were the most up-to-date battleships in the line. They boasted dual-purpose 5-inch 38s, 40-millimeter Bofors, legions of Ehrlichens, and the most modern air surface radar available. These 2 ships were more modern, if not significantly slower, than anything the Japanese could throw their way. Jon, you wanted to talk about Weavy and Tennessee specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, these ships were Weavy in particular very badly damaged at Pearl, and when they dragged her off the bottom and hauled her back to Seattle to rebuild her, she actually gets passed over for some of the other older battleships, and she's not out of the yards until I believe late 43. But one of the things that they did is they massively increased the size of her anti-torpedo blisters. And they realized that this is an old ship and she's never going to go through the Panama Canal again. As soon as this war is over, we are going to scrap her. So we don't have to be governed by this 108, foot beam anymore. And the result is that she now has a beam of 114 feet. And a lot of that is anti-torpedo blisters. So in terms of the depth of her anti-torpedo system, both she and Tennessee have just got massive systems, and it was pretty widely acknowledged that they were probably more resistant to torpedo damage than even ships like the Iowa class because they just had these big systems. Anyway, I just kind of thought that was a cool little tidbit. The other really important piece, though, is that both West Virginia and Tennessee have the Mark 8 fire control radar, which is the latest, greatest set in the American hand. Is that the only 2 though, Seth, or am I?
No, West Virginia had Mark 8. Good. Tennessee had Mark 8. The ones who did not were Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and California. They did not have, or not California, Mississippi and Pennsylvania did not have the Mark 8. They had the Mark 3 surface radar.
And I was going to nerd out a little bit on radar here because it's important in this engagement, obviously, because the Japanese ships have their own radar. But if you look at what's going on with the Mark 8 versus the older Mark 3, the Mark 8, it has a PPI indicator, so the classic top-down view of the world. It's built on the cavity magnetron, so it's got a lot of power. Mark 8 set can put out about 40 kilowatts. And so the range on this thing, you can see a battleship-sized target on this set from about 40,000 yards away, which is well outside the gunnery range of their main batteries, but it gives you a long distance, and it's very good in terms of determining range, and it's even relatively good in terms of determining deflection as well. Right. So the ships with Mark 8 are going to have a marked advantage here, if you'll pardon the pun. Meanwhile, the ships with Mark 3 is not a bad set. I mean, that's what Washington used to dispatch Kirishima, but she also had a really good search set that helped her out. Meanwhile, if you look at the Japanese, the Type 22 radar that Fuso and Yamashiro have is basically a knockoff of the cavity magnetron. They had captured one of these things, and they were remanufacturing it. The problem is that their manufacturing quality was terrible. And there was an anecdotal account in one of the things that I read that said of the first 60 Type 22 sets that they produced, only 6 of them actually operated. So their QA was not great. And the power on that unit is only about 2 kilowatts as opposed to 40 kilowatts. And so it doesn't have nearly the range or the target discrimination that the better American sets have.
Yeah,
And
and
John,
you
I'm going
know,
to go back to my ET days, when my electronic technician days, when I was enlisted, and ask you, magnetron and not a power klystron. I'm just those are the two
Those are the two
versions of
competing
radar back in
designs.
these days. Yeah,
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 back
good.
in those days.
So anyway,
Well, and
swat it back to you.
I would
yeah, I
add,
was.
I would
Go
add
ahead.
something. The Japanese did have a clever offset, and it worked nearly as good. I forget the range offhand, but they had what were called radar detectors, and they looked
Mhm.
a little like badminton paddles.
Yeah.
On the front of the destroyers, you could really see them better. But on the cruisers and the others, they're more hidden by the supercharger. But you really see them on the destroyer bridges more clearly. They look a little like badminton paddles, and what they could do is they could pick up radar emissions, even bearing and stuff. So in a kind of roundabout way, the Japanese used the American radar against them.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
use it to detect, and they often did detect it first, meaning got a clear bearing or realized that it's an enemy ship sooner
Right.
than a U.S. radar ship realized they were not looking at land on a ship. So sometimes it worked out the same way. I mean, as far as for
It
setting
gives
ranges.
you a clue that you're being looked at, but it doesn't give you the target discrimination necessary to fire. And that's
Right.
the
No,
Exactly.
all it gives you is range,
Right.
bearing.
And
Yeah, it doesn't give you range. It's not very accurate in bearing, but you can detect twice the range that the radar is detecting because it only has to go one way. So that's the advantage. You call it
the,
electronic surveillance measures in modern talk.
the key between the Mark 8 and the Mark 3 though here is twofold. One, you said that the Mark 8 is, you know, and it can really get out there. It can distinguish, or it could distinguish between ships and land, whereas the Mark 3 couldn't. And what's important to note is that the flagship of the American battle line is USS Mississippi, which has the Mark 3. So, and this kind of, you would
Once
have
again,
thought, yeah, you would have thought that, you know, Admiral Whaler would have said, you know what, maybe I need to go to the more modern ship, which would have been at this point West Virginia, as opposed to USS Mississippi, especially when he knows it's a surface battle coming up. And this does play a part, albeit minor, but it does play a part as to when the battleships do open fire, when the fur balls does start to unravel here in the very near future.
Yeah.
So, Bill, tell us about Oldendorf's plan. This is about as classic of a naval ambush as you can possibly get.
Yeah, so somebody's going to call me a liar because I think in our Battle of Cape Esperance episode, I said that was the last time we ever had a crossing of the T. And maybe that's not true. You guys can correct me because that's essentially what happens here. The battleships would
absolutely
form.
it is.
Yeah, the battleships would form in a single file line across the mouth of the strait. I'm going to show you the map here. There it is, right? And it looks like crossing a T, sitting in such ways to expose all of their guns, their broadsides, in essence, using the main battery against the Japanese as they come up the strait. It's the classic maneuver. On his flanks, Oldendorf deployed his cruisers, steaming on diagonal lines. These ships would be expected to provide rapid, accurate 6 and 8 inch main battery fire. Now, were any of these what were they called, machine gun cruisers, John?
Yeah, we do
Very
have some
close.
of our 6-inch models in there, and yes, they, as we know, they can put out a very heavy volume of fire. The
Boy,
other thing I was
Yeah.
going to point out, you know, just on that lovely little map, there is just how constricted the waters are here. The narrowest part of the strait is less than 15 nautical miles apart, and you'll recall when we were talking about the Battle of Savo Island, and I was, you know, inveighing against the fact that, you know, it's only about 22 nautical miles from Henderson Field all the way across to Tulagi. These are even tighter waters. And Oldendorf at this point has just built himself the perfect, you know, plug to go into that
exactly.
bottom. I mean, there's just nowhere to maneuver really, especially if he's got forces placed on both flanks, which he very intelligently does.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
south of
So
these cruisers are the destroyers, which are just deadly in this event. The destroyers would hug the shoreline trying to hide themselves from Japanese radar. They would try and camouflage themselves amongst the coast there to stay out of sight. The first to come into contact with Nishimura would be the plywood PT boats that we were referring to earlier, however, of which there were dozens, actually 39, deployed and ready to go. These little vessels would launch torpedo attacks, but more than anything else, they would act as scouts reporting on Nishimura's advance and the status of his formation as the battle develops. The Japanese, if they made it up the strait and past the PTs and destroyers, the literal school of torpedoes that the destroyers would launch would be met by a wall of radar-directed rapid fire from the American and Australian cruisers before the battleships would theoretically deliver the coup de grace. Pretty straightforward plan. I mean, it's about as easy as you can get, and it's about as simple as you can get. And like you said, John, I mean, the terrain for, is dictating every single thing that's going to go around here. And Oldendorf's got that massive plug in that bottle, just like you were talking about. Ammunition is something we need to talk about because this comes into play a little bit here in just a bit. Ammunition, specifically for the battleships, was a bit of a problem. Oldendorf's ships, which were almost always employed as shore bombardment vessels, were loaded with a large amount of HE shells, which won't do a whole hell of a lot against Japanese battleships. They were loaded with 77% HE to 23% AP, to be exact, just before the operation began. Oldendorf's 6 battle wagons had roughly 1,600 AP rounds between them, and roughly the same in HE after having bombarded targets all week long. Well, and 1,600 rounds does sound like a lot of ammunition, but as you are going to see, it's really not that
you
much.
can fire a lot of that off in a pretty short amount of time. Yes, I was intrigued actually by that percentage because that's sort of the mirror image of what you would tend to see in a battleship loadout, which would be predominantly armor piercing and just a smattering of HE if you needed it. But given the mission of these particular ships, that's perfectly logical.
And that's the key. That's the key. Go ahead, Tony.
I wanted to mention to touch back on it just for a moment because it's part of the setup as it unfolds. The terrain question, the American battleship battle line is also having to mind the terrain, the narrowness of the strait that John talked about. They're doing it what amounts to a continual loop like this at a pretty slow speed, close to 12 knots or so at times. They'd speed up as they needed to or thought they saw torpedoes or something. But they're kind of doing this motion back and forth. And they're always having to do a complicated simultaneous turn as they reach the end of the space on each side. And more than once, it could nearly lead to a collision. But so they're doing this, and they'll be doing that even during the Gunfire battle. West Virginia had scraped her underwater hull and apparently dinged a propeller or something on October 21. So she was reduced to 16 knots.
Wow.
Have higher speed than that. She wouldn't need it in this battle, but that might have influenced why Whaler didn't transfer his flag to her. In other words, it's a ship more limited in capability, even though it's the best one for a lot of reasons. So I wanted to mention that in case that wasn't realized about West Virginia. And the terrain thing about how they're using it, that the same with the cruisers, the left and right flank cruisers are the same.
Got a patrol line and they're just going, circular around it. There's also a little island at the very top of the strait too that they had to be careful of. They couldn't get too close to that because it's going to obscure their gunfire, and so that means that the battleship force needs to be basically in the western part of the channel in order to not mask their own gunfire by that island. But anyway, nerding on the details.
No, it's all about the details, baby. All about the details. So as a result of the ammunition, I don't want to call it a shortage, but a disparity, let's call it. Yeah, exactly. Oldendorf issues an order that states to his battleships they would not open fire until the enemy approached to within 17 to 20,000 yards, which is pretty friggin' close for a battleship to start letting loose with their main battery. At that range, Oldendorf was confident that his battle wagons would be more accurate with their heavy shells, and the valuable rounds would not be wasted with ineffective shooting. And believe me, they aren't. And while the ammo was fine for one battle, if the battle became prolonged, or, and this is key for later, if the battleships had to fight another battle, ammunition could potentially be a serious issue.
Yeah.
So, guys, as the battle approaches, Oldendorf and his ships are ready, to say the least. They knew the Japanese were coming. They knew from which direction, and they were confident in their shooting, radar, and composition. If everything went right, Surigao Strait would be less of a battle and more of a nautical execution. And I don't think that's an overstatement. I really don't.
That's exactly what it is. One of the things that strikes me, I mean, we talk about this, of course, as a battleship action, but really at the end of the day, it is Oldendorf's massive superiority in light forces that is the telling factor here, because, you know, they're going to whittle the Japanese well down to size before the big girls can even open up. And that,
Oh, yeah.
so let's start with the littlest of them, right?
Let's get to it. So,
Yep.
Bill, at 1950, Oldendorf receives a message from Desron 54, and this is incredibly important. From Desron's 54 CO Captain J.G. Coward. Tell us about what goes down here.
Yep. Admiral Hiroshio Oldendorf on HMS Victory orders the fleet to tack into the wind and uncover the broadsides. As the unfortunately named Captain Coward, Desron, was not part of Oldendorf's original battle plan. His squadron was not assigned to Oldendorf's bombardment units. So Coward, overhearing the TBS and surmising that a serious surface battle was soon in the offing, took the initiative and inserted himself. This is a big deal. Inserted himself into Oldendorf's plans. He received a message that read, "In case of surface contact to southward, I plan to make an immediate torpedo attack and then retire to clear you. With your approval, I will submit plans shortly." Needless to say, Oldendorf happily approves, as Coward had not been counted on initially, and his destroyers now added even more firepower to the coming ambush. So you got the PT boats that can, attack with torpedoes, and a destroyer squadron that can attack with torpedoes. Seth, as Jon said, this should do good work here, right?
Oh, big time.
I'm reminded of Nelson's quote that no captain can do very wrong if he lays his ship alongside that of an enemy. I mean, like,
Close the enemy.
Close
Yeah,
the
exactly.
enemy. So we got Captain Coward showing up with his Desron and saying, I'm going to do this. And of course, Oldendorf is like, you're my kind of guy,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nishimura clearly holds to that.
Yeah.
As we're going to
And then
see,
delivers.
yeah,
Mhm.
big time, and we'll get to the details of that. But I mean, Coward's force, debatably, arguably, is pretty much the most decisive force in this battle. But we'll get there. He would attack Coward would attack in two groups from two sides and hopefully slip some fish into Nishimura's ships before they ever knew what hit them. His destroyers would approach at high speed, 30 knots. Actually, they don't, but regardless of this, and would fire torpedoes only. He is a student of the Guadalcanal campaign. He knows full well that to not fire guns, do not give away your position with your muzzle flashes, just fire the fish, only shoot if you absolutely have to, and keep themselves hidden from Japanese return fire. Now, guys, Tony, Jon, can you guys give us an estimation of what Nishimura was expecting to encounter as he's going to proceed up this strait? What is he thinking is going to be up there waiting for him, if anything at all?
Exact moment, at that particular moment, what he's expecting is batches of torpedo boats, PT boats, and destroyers. He is expecting destroyers. The latest information he had from recon planes from Cebu had shown none of the battleships they had seen earlier. They'd apparently withdrawn eastward. Even Ugaki believed that. So the latest Japanese intelligence as dusk came was that the battleship forces that their Mogami search plane had sighted earlier had moved east out of Leyte Gulf. But really what it was is Oldendorf doing the complicated maneuvering to get around that island Jon mentioned, get around that island and then get the battle line tucked into its ambush position. But by the motion that went out to the east for a while, the Japanese thought they'd left the strait uncovered. So they were expecting at that time only PT boats and destroyers.
Right. And if you've got a pair of battleships and a heavy cruiser along with
We're not
you,
really worried about those.
Right. You should be able to fight
a crack
through
destroyer squadron like this Division 4.
Right.
So, as expected, no surprise here, the PT boats are the very first guys, Americans, to encounter Nishimura's force. And the van of the Japanese column was the Mogami and 2 destroyers. The 2 battleships and destroyer Shigure trailed behind the lead ships. Nishimura had sent Mogami ahead to see what may be in store for his force as it entered the strait. At 22:36, PT 131, skippered by Ensign Peter Gadd, picked up Nishimura's force on his radar set. Almost instantly, 3 PTs opened throttle, raced across the water at the Japanese, flying along at about 24 knots. I say flying because PTs could actually get a hell of a lot faster than that.
Faster than
At
that.
20, yeah, big time. At
But you don't want
22:50,
to.
good. Yeah.
You don't want to, because
No.
one of the reasons the Coward Squadron is at lower speed too. High speed creates big wakes and bow
Exactly.
waves, and those are visible, especially to lookouts of the caliber that the Japanese can boast. And so, really, even in a PT boat, you're going to try to do your best to sneak in before you launch your fish, and then you're going to gun the engines and get the hell out of Dodge.
And that is precisely what happens here.
And at night, it's bioluminescence. And during the daytime, of course, you can still see those wakes on radar.
Right. Right.
So at 22:52, Japanese lookouts aboard Shigure saw the PTs headed for their column and began to open fire. So ironically enough, the first shots of Surigao Strait are fired by the Japanese. Gadd's radar picture clarifies when his initial 2 blips spread out into 5 as he neared Nishimura. In the darkness, he could make out the shapes of the 2 towering pagoda masts of the 2 Japanese battleships, 2 cruisers, and another destroyer. As the PTs race in, the Japanese fired star shells, and Yamashira's secondary battery opens fire on the Americans. The PTs were taken under pretty intense Japanese and somewhat accurate Japanese shell fire. Bill, what's going on in the ensuing catfight that goes on out here?
Melee. Yeah, the PTs made slashing attacks along the Japanese surface forces under intense Japanese fire, illuminated by those star shells most of the time. As one of the boats, BT 152, made its attack on Shigure, the latter's searchlight snapped on, illuminating 152 for all the world to see. Being chased down by Shigure, 152 seemed like a goner, and she was already hit and damaged with some dead crew. 152's skipper ordered his 40-millimeter gun crew to take out Shigure's searchlight in an effort to escape. This is not easy when you're going fast in any boat. Bouncing along, the TV movies, they make it look easy. It is not. PT 130 slid in behind 152 and laid smoke to help out as 152 boats 40-millimeter hammered away at Shigure's light. Suddenly, the night went black again for the 152 boat, and she escaped with no further damage as either the light was cut off or it was actually shot out by the fleeing PT.
I was just going to say, I mean, if we're within Beaufort's range of these Japanese vessels, we ourselves, of course, are within 25-millimeter anti-aircraft range of the Japanese ships. So, there's a lot of light ACAC that's being thrown around in this engagement because the ranges are that close.
And that's that's something that in your mind's eye when you picture that the close proximity, talk about hair raising. I mean, these are plywood vessels attacking Japanese battleships and cruisers and destroyers at spitball range when it comes to automatic weapons fire. I mean, this is friggin' close. So the remainder of the PT boat attacks against Nishimura went kind of similar to 152's escapade. Close encounters with Japanese destroyers and secondary batteries of battleships caused all of the torpedoes fired by the American PTs to miss their intended targets at this time. I know, Tony, you want to get to this in just a second. But what the PT attacks lacked in damage inflicted, they scored in reporting enemy position and track, albeit the latter information arriving in Oldendorf's hands an hour and a half after the initial combat had begun. Needless to say, nevertheless, Oldendorf is aware that his enemy is indeed coming up the strait, and he's getting ready to make ready for them. Now, the PTs had done their job. Did they inflict any damage on Nishimura's force initially? No, not really. But, Tony, the PTs do later, we're jumping a little bit ahead of time, do inflict some damage on Shima, don't they?
Yes. By this time, Shima's had gotten his force assigned to go in to Leyte Gulf right behind Nishimura, but in a totally separate force, because he was originally assigned to carry a group of troops down to reinforce Leyte Island, and didn't want that assignment. He managed to get his ships assigned to follow Nishimura in. They weren't more closely coordinated, but it's kind of misunderstood that it wasn't in Shima and Nishimura's power to coordinate with each other. That's something Kurita needed to do from his seniority, or Toyota above them as CNC of Combined Fleet. Nishimura and Shima could hardly not talk to each other because they're not even aware of what the other's doing, except for an occasional mention of radio silence. But it turned out Shima is by this time, is barely an hour behind.
I was just going to, for the sake of our listeners here, so we've got two Japanese forces. We've got Nishimura's force that's come up from Brunei that's built around the battleships, right? And then there's this other guy we just started talking about, a guy named Shima, who is centered on a single heavy cruiser, the Mogami. Two? Oh, yeah. Hello. And originally, Shima's force actually comes down from the north, does it not? And right. And so these two forces have met, and now they're not really operating together. They're just sort of in the same neighborhood. And Shima is trailing along in Nishimura's wake with his two heavy cruisers and other light combatants. So just wanted to throw that out here for people.
They're both shown here. So while Shima comes from the north, he's entering. This is a dotted line here. He's entering the channel essentially along the same axis that the southern force was entering.
And so to cover what Seth was alluding to is, so when Shima comes in doing the same thing Nishimura had done just about an hour before, when Shima comes in, he does get hit by a PT boat torpedo when they do the same thing they attack his force the exact same way. They hit the light cruiser Bukuma with a torpedo that cripples her and makes her fall out of formation, where the two heavy cruisers, Nachi and Ashigura, have to go on with destroyers alone. So the PT boats did get a score then, a little bit later in the battle. That's all.
Of the 39 boats that were in the strait, talking about attacking Nishimura, 30 were able to deliver torpedo attacks and launch 34 fish in the water. 10 PT boats were hit, and only one was lost to enemy fire. 3 Americans had been killed, and a further 20 had been wounded aboard the PTs. Now, guys, on the Japanese side of things, Nishimura had run the gauntlet of PTs and emerged relatively unscathed, and still in some sort of formation. As his force moves through the last of the PTs, Southern force was set to face a far more formidable threat than the PT boats, though. Can you guys, was he expecting a destroyer attack at this point?
Tossing it to you, Tony. You wrote the book, baby.
No, at this point, he's expecting more of the same. In fact, as the torpedo attacks come from Coward's destroyers, the Japanese think it's more of the same. Torpedo boats firing from longer range to protect themselves. It takes a little while to realize they're destroyed. Now, Fuso does. Fuso spots Melvin, and they engage in a fight that you'll see. But from Nishimura's perspective, he doesn't realize their destroyers attacking him right away. Unless, and this should be allowed for, because with the translations, it can be tricky. He says, we're proceeding while engaging and destroying enemy torpedo boats. Given the translation, it may be the torpedo boat he's using for the word destroyer. It can be tricky. It doesn't mean that's something that needs to be allowed for, but he's definitely not thinking in terms of cruisers or battleships yet.
Yeah.
He's aware of
this actually starts to bring out a thing that we're going to see in the later parts of the battle. Nishimura is on the flagship, which is Yamashiro, which is up at the front of the force. Fuso is behind him. And as the battle goes on, you're going to see Nishimura is increasingly unaware of what is happening to Fuso, and is just, he's more focused on what's, coming up rather than what's happening over his shoulder. And that's going to be problematic for Fuso.
Well, as interesting and as fascinating as it is, and because we all know what's coming up next, we're not going to talk about that in this episode. We're going to stop because we've got so much detail we want to discuss. This is part 1 of Surigao Strait. I'm going to cut the conversation here. And guys, if you're listening and or watching, tune in next week for the remainder of Surigao Strait, because it's about to get really,
it's going to get real
juicy. It's going to get juicy. Guys, is there anything you want to add in before we wrap this episode up, before next week's episode when we get to to the main event. Is there anything else you guys want to throw in here? Tony, you
Yes,
look like you do.
the PT Bold attack that's just concluded. One thing to notice, it was so bravely and courageously conducted. I mean, it's straight out of a Hollywood movie. It really was.
Well, you're not
I
kidding.
mean,
It really is.
but what was most lacking, and it had Oldendorf been standing over their shoulder, he would have been rolling his eyes and doing all this. What absolutely was lacking was them reporting the Japanese fleet first. Their orders were to report, then attack. Report, then attack. They attacked so fast that most of them got crippled and got their radios knocked out. They almost got into a situation where they failed to notify Oldendorf.
Mhm.
It was a quick thinking of one of the PT boats whose radio was knocked out. He's going, oh shit, I need to figure out. So he barreled north at maximum speed, opened the gun on his PT boat to an intact group of PT boats that hadn't yet attacked and said, radio Oldendorf, the following information. And that's how Oldendorf got it.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of funny because the same phenomenon often would sometimes happen with American submarines. They would attack in Japanese submarines, absolutely. Both of them had a tendency to attack first rather than radio because that's so. The Philippines had an important exception to that. They'd attack first, and if they were held down too long, they didn't get the report out. Here you see it happening with the PT boats. The enthusiasm to attack, they also got damaged enough where they couldn't report it. They almost weren't able to. So that's an important thing as we lead into the next one. Realize that Oldendorf, he has his information, he's ready, but he easily might not have.
Yeah.
Right.
And it takes a long time for him to get that message. It's
Yeah.
over 90
Probably
minutes
account
before
for
he
why
gets that
it's
message.
late
Yeah.
to some degree, but some of it's, I don't know why it took as long as it did, because even allowing for the delay of relaying to another PT boat.
Yeah. Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, please tune into our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Guys, tune in next week for the exciting conclusion of the Battle of Surigao Strait. Once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for being here. Jon, thank you as always for being here with us this week. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise,
Tony.
always great. Yep.
Tony,
My
my man.
esteemed co-author.
Thank you very much for being here with us this week, and we will see you again next week, both of you guys, next week for the exciting conclusion of the Battle of Surigao Strait. Bill,
Yes, it was
bring us
great.
home.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again for what one of my quartermasters used to call the Battle of Subaru Strait next week.